The budget resolution before us today represents an inflection point for our nation. We face numerous interconnected crises which have been made far worse by the COVID-19 pandemic and economic fallout. As we recover from both, if we are recovering from both, we can emerge from this period of despair as a stronger and more equitable nation by resolving to build back better. Today, we begin another part of that process. The concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2022 provides a fiscal framework for Congress to achieve this goal, and as the chairman of the House Budget Committee, I'm honored to present this resolution to you today. In March, I came before this committee to present the American Rescue Plan, a bold, compassionate, and aggressive legislative package that provided immediate COVID-19 relief and economic support to families and communities in every corner of the nation. After hundreds of thousands of American lives lost, an economic crisis touching nearly all aspects of society, and a year of uncertainty and hardship, the American Rescue Plan was a turning point in our nation's fight against COVID-19. Shots are getting into arms, not nearly enough. Americans are returning to work, and our economy is growing at its fastest rate in 40 years. We are on a path toward a stronger, more inclusive recovery because of that historic legislation. And thankfully, there are still resources available to respond to this fourth wave from the Delta variant. I just hope that the individuals who are finally grasping how dangerous this virus is can come to this realization when they only need a shot to protect them and not a ventilator to keep them alive. The American Rescue Plan is making a difference in the lives of the American people every day. But even with this important progress, our work is not done. The rescue plan was targeted to meet the immediate needs created by the pandemic and resulting economic crisis, not to address the other serious deficits in our society. Long before the pandemic, decades of federal underinvestment in climate, education, housing, childcare, healthcare, and other sectors have made it harder for American families to make ends meet and for American businesses to compete globally. To ensure a stronger and more secure future for our people, our economy, and our nation, we must close these deficits now. This budget resolution gives us that opportunity. The resolution's reconciliation instructions provide Congress with a $3.5 trillion gross investment to lower costs for families, create good-paying jobs, and cut taxes for hardworking Americans. The Build Back Better plan's transformational investments will improve our education, health, and child care systems, establish paid family and medical leave, tackle the climate crisis, address the housing crisis, and more, all while making our country more competitive in the global marketplace for decades to come. To help offset these investments, our plan calls for reforming the tax code to ensure that large corporations and the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share. No one making $400,000 per year or less will see their taxes go up. Instead, hardworking Americans and families will benefit from much-deserved tax relief, such as the extension of the Biden Child Tax Credit and other tax credits for families and workers enacted in the rescue plan. And the plan will finally allow Medicare to negotiate the cost of prescription drugs, putting money back in the pockets of seniors and saving the federal government billions of dollars. We cannot afford to miss this opportunity. Forecasts from Moody's Analytics and the International Monetary Fund predict that the pro-growth investments in this plan will put our nation on a more fiscally responsible path forward, increasing GDP growth and job growth over the next decade and improving labor force participation. And we know from decades of research that investments in education and economic security for families of young children can yield a lifetime of benefits: increased wages, improved health, and reduced crime, among others. This budget resolution, already passed by the Senate, reflects the net investment of the Build Back Better plan as allocated across 13 House committees. It instructs these committees to report legislation consistent with these budgetary targets to the Budget Committee by September 15th. The Budget Committee will then combine the legislation and prepare it for floor consideration. In addition, the resolution also provides for budget enforcement in 2022 and includes other necessary technical language. We must act quickly because America cannot wait any longer. We can no longer afford the costs of neglect and inaction. And before I yield the floor, I'd just like to add a couple things. One of the things that I'm so impressed with by the Biden administration, both with the American Rescue Plan and the American Jobs and Families Plan, is that they have changed the mentality of how we think about the government and the problems of the country. For decades and decades and decades, my experience has been that whenever we discussed a problem, whether it was nutrition, as the chairman has been involved in for many years, housing, whatever it may be, the first question we always asked was, what can we afford to do? This administration is asking the questions now in the right order. The right order are, what do we need to do for the American people? What do we need to serve them? And the second question, after we've resolved that one, is how do we resource those needs? This is an important change in thinking, and it reflects what I and many others have said for a long time, that we can afford to do whatever the American people need us to do. But more importantly than that, we must do whatever we can to make life better for the American people. That's within our capacity. So with that, I look forward to taking your questions, and I yield back.